Welcome to our session on the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. We've completed Joshua and Judges, so the people are now in the land. And the last thing that we read is that there's this moral anarchy that's taking place, and that leads us into the books of Samuel. Samuel, the two books, in Hebrew they're actually just one book, but I'll refer to them as we do in English, which is 1st and 2nd Samuel. There are three major shifts that are narrated in God's kingdom that take place in 1st and 2nd Samuel. First, Israel's worship shifts from Shiloh to Jerusalem. Now this doesn't happen until 2nd Samuel 6, but the tabernacle in the book of 1st Samuel is located in Shiloh, and then eventually it moves to Jerusalem. This is significant because, of course, the temple is located in Jerusalem, and that becomes the capital, not just of the nation of Israel, but the capital of God's kingdom. The second shift we see is there are judges prior to this, and Samuel serves actually as the last judge, and he becomes kind of a prophet as he moves on. But the leadership changes from judges to kingship. Now that kingship is first under Saul, but then eventually it goes under David for the majority of these two books. And then third and finally, Israel is transformed from a group of tribes to a unified kingdom. So prior to this in Judges, they were 12 tribes, and they operated relatively independently of each other. But by the time we get into Samuel, and especially when they appoint a king, they become one nation. So they become the nation of Israel. There's still 12 tribes of Israel, but the focus is on them being one single nation at this point. I want to look at the outline a little more in depth here. I'm going to go through some major portions of the outline, talk about it a little bit, and then move on to the next portion. So the story of Samuel takes up the first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel. And the book starts with Hannah. So Hannah's song is not until later in chapter 1 and 2. But the book starts out with Hannah being barren. She's unable to bear children. So why start the book with a barren woman? That's the question. Now, this obviously reminds us of Abraham and Sarah. So there's some connections there, but the main reason that the book starts with a barren woman is this is actually the spiritual condition of the nation. They are spiritually barren. Just as Hannah physically is unable to bear children, she's physically barren, so the nation is spiritually barren. And Eli and his children, when you read the first few chapters, demonstrate Israel's spiritual barrenness. These men are priests, but they're committing all kinds of immorality. Eli refuses to confront his sons over it. And so Hannah's barrenness then, which shifts into her becoming pregnant, demonstrates that God is going to act. In the midst of Israel's spiritual barrenness, God will act in some way. Now, Hannah has her song that actually has connections with Mary's song in the Gospel of Luke, but we're going to just talk about Hannah for right now. So some themes in Hannah's song are God's holy sovereignty. Specifically, another theme is the reversal of human fortunes. That's in verses 4 through 5 and then 8, the end of 8. The song shows that the past history of Israel points to God as the great reverser of human values. So, for example, in creation starts with chaos. It's formless and void, and then it turns into order. Exodus, Israel goes from bondage to freedom. So there is this reversal of human events or human values that takes place. We also see reversals occur in the lives of several major characters. First in Hannah, right? She goes from being barren to having a child. We see reversal in the lives of Samuel. Saul, right? Saul starts out as king, and then eventually he loses the throne. And then David, who starts out as a shepherd boy who becomes king eventually. Samuel, to go back to that one, goes on to become a national leader, while Eli's 2 sons kept failing and falling, even though they were priests. Saul's family is not important in Israel, but he's chosen to be the first king. Then, so you have that reversal where unimportant clan to becoming the king, and then you have another reversal in Saul where he's the king to being rejected. So you have two reversals in Saul. And then David, he's not only a shepherd boy, but he's the youngest in his family, and then he eventually becomes king. So you have several reversals that Hannah's song brings out, and these are themes that are going to occur throughout the book. Another theme is that of kingship. So there's a new direction in Israel's fortunes as a result of kingship. And the kingship, the human kingship, is meant to demonstrate Yahweh's kingship. We'll talk more about that later. A little bit more about the introduction. So those are some themes of Hannah's song. But Eli and his family represent the continuation of the anarchy that characterizes the period of Judges, whereas Hannah and her line represent the solution to that. So with Samuel, the time of prophecy and vision will arrive, and we see through that God will intervene in Israel's history to save Israel from save Israel not from enemies, but save Israel from herself and from her own sin. So chapters 1 through 7 move to the line of Eli being judged and God raising Samuel as judge. Okay, next we have a transitional chapter, which is chapter 8, which is the transition to the monarchy. So the people come to Samuel and they request a king like the nations around them. What they mean by this is a dynastic kingship, right, where one person serves as king, then his son serves as king, then his son serves as king, so it's a dynasty, right? That's the opposite, of course, of what happened in Judges, right? Usually a judge, his son was not a judge. Rather, God raised up judges himself, kind of spontaneously, of his own choosing, that is, but there's no dynasty implied with kingship. And we see in chapter 8, verse 6, that this request displeases Samuel. So then we have to ask, why is it a problem? Why is it bad that they requested a king? In verse 7, God says that they've rejected him. So this dynastic kingship would eliminate the direction by God that the judges had provided, and it removes the spiritual guidance from God by providing a doctrine of ordered succession. So the people are lacking faith in God to lead them successfully, to raise up rulers that they need when they need them. And so they rebel against God's rule by depending on a king, not God, to save them from foreign oppression. Now, if you've carefully read the Old Testament, particularly the book of Deuteronomy 17 actually mentions kingship. So if Deuteronomy sanctions a king, why is that still a problem? Well, on the one hand, it's not, right? Kingship is within the scope of the Mosaic covenant, and the sin is not the request for a king itself, it's the reason for desiring a king, namely that they lack faith in God to guide them. They don't trust that God could guide them through judges again. They want a king, and so that they would know who his successors are. So the reason for the request is the problem, not the request itself. The irony is that in chapter 7, God had just protected them from the Philistines, and they set up an Ebenezer to show that God has helped them, and then immediately after that they request a king. So it's ironic that after God has already delivered them, they demonstrate their lack of faith. And so adjustment is needed then in the office of king. Namely, we see this in Samuel, where prophecy and the role of a prophet comes into place, where 1 Samuel 9, Samuel comes on to protect God's direct rule over Israel, and the prophet's goal was to remind the kings of God's kingship over them. So the king served as a king under God's kingship. He was like an under king in some ways. So that's a major portion of Samuel, or it's a significant chapter where they request a king like the nations around them. Then we move into the story of Saul. Right, so in chapters 13 through 15, there's two situations between Saul and Samuel. In chapter 13, Samuel tells Saul that his dynasty was rejected. You can read about why that is. And then in chapter 15, we see that not just Saul's dynasty is rejected, but Saul himself is rejected as king, which then leads us into the story of Saul and David, which takes up the remainder of 1 Samuel. So it's chapters 16 through 31. So there's an interesting contrast that takes place in these chapters. There's usually a story of David or a story of Saul and then a story of David. So the author flips back and forth between telling about Saul and telling about David in these chapters. And the reason for that is it's to provide a contrast between David and Saul, primarily to show that David is the better man, that David is the one who should be king. So let me give you some examples. You have David and Goliath in chapter 17, where it shows Saul cowering, David fighting. In chapter 18, there's Saul's jealousy of David, and Saul doesn't give David his daughter as he promised, whereas David defeats the Philistines. Chapter 19, Saul tries to kill David. Chapters 22 and 23, Saul kills the priests, whereas David saves the city of Keilah. And then in chapter 24, David spares Saul. So there's just some examples showing the contrast, and they show that David has proved himself greater than Saul and that he is a man after God's own heart. Next section in Samuel is 2 Samuel chapters 1 through 8, and these are the rise of David. So the section begins with David learning of the death of Saul and Jonathan, and then it moves to one of Saul's sons attempting to take the throne. However, David is anointed king of Israel in chapter 5, and then he moves the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem in chapter 6. And what this does is this tells us that God will now take up his residence in Jerusalem, that this will now be not just the seat of David as king and the capital of future kings, but this is also the place where God is going to make his dwelling place. And again, prior to this, the tabernacle appeared to be in Shiloh. God was worshipped at smaller shrines throughout the land. There was not a central place of worship. But when David moves the ark, that's what makes this the central place of worship. This section peaks, though, chapters 1 through 8, has a climax when God entrusts his kingdom to the house of David with a covenant with David. So 2 Samuel 7 is the Davidic covenant and the most significant chapter probably in both books. So let's talk a little bit about the Davidic covenant, because this is, we have the Abrahamic covenant, you have the Mosaic covenant, and you have the Davidic covenant. These are the three most significant covenants in the Old Testament. And when you read through it, it can be a little confusing. So I want to break it down. There's three main sections of promises to David. So first, there's promises during David's lifetime. Then there's future blessings to David's son. And then there's a distant future of promises. So the first promises during David's lifetime, God promises to make his name great. He promises to give Israel a secure place from their enemies. He promises to give David rest from all his enemies. And ultimately, these three promises we see are fulfilled in 2 Samuel 8, where David completes the conquest that was started in Joshua, and he completes what the judges were unable to do. He subdues his enemies on all sides, and the people of Israel have rest. They're no longer at war. So these are the promises that are fulfilled during David's lifetime, and chapter 8 demonstrates that fulfillment. Then there's future blessings to his son. So this would be Solomon, of course, as we know, but God promises to raise up offspring who will come from David, which again is fulfilled in Solomon. God promises to establish Solomon's kingdom. And then finally, God promises that he will be Solomon's father, and Solomon will be God's son. So there's an element of discipline that's involved here in the father-son relationship. So God will discipline David's son according to Solomon's covenant loyalty. So as long as Solomon is faithful to the covenant, there will not be discipline. When he disobeys, God will discipline him. But God ultimately promises that he will not take away his loving kindness, his steadfast love, however your translations put it, that he will, even though he disciplines Solomon, he will not take away his loving kindness from him. So the Davidic covenant we see from this is the covenant itself is unconditional, but the king's experience will depend on his obedience to the Mosaic covenant. So if Solomon and David's descendants are faithful to the covenant, they will experience, if they're faithful to the Mosaic covenant, they will experience blessings associated with that. But even if they're unfaithful, God will still be faithful to the Davidic covenant and to raise up David's offspring. Specifically, when talking about a remote future, God promises that David's house will endure forever. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, his literal house. It means his lineage, his dynasty, his descendants. He promises that his kingdom will endure forever and that his throne will be established forever. So these are the promises that, of course, don't happen in David's lifetime or Solomon's lifetime, because we see very clearly that there is no forever. David doesn't rule forever. Solomon doesn't rule forever. But these are promises that will happen. So even if the kings are unfaithful to the Mosaic covenant, God will still bring it about so that David's house will rule forever and his kingdom will endure forever. So the Davidic covenant, I can't stress this enough, is the most significant chapter in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and it's one of the most significant chapters in the rest of the Bible. The prophets pick it up and discuss it, and that's developed some things from it, which we'll talk about later. But you need to know the significance of 2 Samuel 7 and the Davidic covenant. Then we move into a section where we go to the fall of David. So this section provides a test to the covenant. So each covenant is tested before to see whether God will be faithful in it. Right? Abraham in his unbelief fathers a child by Hagar. God's still faithful to bring a son through Sarah. Israel worships the golden calf immediately after they say they'll follow the Mosaic covenant. And so after David sins here, so in chapter 9 is sin with Bathsheba, David loses almost all initiative. He no longer acts, but he's acted upon by different things. And in these chapters, David's sins come home. So David lusts after Bathsheba, and then his son Ammon lusts after Tamar in chapter 13. David kills Uriah, and his son Absalom kills his other son Ammon. So these sins that David did are repeated in his children. And then finally, chapters 15 through 20 are Absalom's rebellion. And the story repeatedly emphasizes David's failure to act. David could have acted, but he does not. And the author highlights this over and over and over again. Which then takes us to the epilogue, right, in chapters 21 through 24. So chapter 23 points to David as the ideal ruler, that he brings blessing and he meets the expectations that are raised in 1 Samuel 2 for a king who would follow God and follow after his heart. So the book concludes by reminding the audience with a reminder of David's greatness and of their hope in the house of David. Even though he failed at the end of his reign and he sinned, the author still, at the end of the book, wants to remind the readers to have hope in the house of David. Now, this hope isn't because David is such a great man. This hope is because of God's covenant with David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Okay, message and purpose of the book. So first, it highlights the establishment of the monarchy in Israel. So most of the book is taken up with the preparation of David to sit on the throne, right? So in 2 Samuel 1 Samuel chapter 16, so we see very clearly David is the one who should pick the throne, and then that's carried out throughout the rest of the book. Second, as I mentioned before, the centrality of the Davidic covenant is highlighted, and this is significant for the remainder of the biblical story, which I'll talk about in a moment. These are the two major points of the purpose of the book, is to highlight how the kingship is established and to highlight the centrality of the Davidic covenant. Okay, the place in the biblical story of Samuel. So how does this fit with the story we've been developing so far? So we're looking specifically at 2 Samuel 7 here, and there's a number of connections with Abraham and Adam that are mentioned. First, God promises to make David's name great. This is similar to the promise made to Abraham in Genesis 12:2, that God would make Abraham's name great. Also, second, God promises a place where he would plant Israel. This is similar to the promise of land that is given to Abraham, and then Eden for Adam, right? That there's a place that's promised to Abraham, and that Adam resided in prior to that, which was a land established by God, which was Eden for Adam, and which is the land of Canaan for Abraham, and then eventually for David. And David eventually makes this land secure for the nation, as I mentioned in 2 Samuel 8. Third, God promises a place of security where the wicked will not oppress his people, and that's reminiscent of God's promise to curse those who curse Abraham. Fourth, God promises that David's descendants will be a son to God. And this is reminiscent of Adam, where it says in Genesis 5:1 that he is the son of God. So the king and David's line of kings are meant to have a similar relationship to God as Adam did. Finally, there's the promise of one of David's line that will rule forever. And again, this mirrors Adam and Eve being priestly kings who are meant to rule over the earth. In the same way, one of David's descendants will rule forever. So the question then is, where does the kingship fit in the larger Old Testament story of God's mission to redeem and restore his creation and Israel's calling to participate in it? So the covenant people, Israel, as a whole, were called to be an instrument of blessings, or an instrument of blessing to the nations, right? That's promised to Abraham that the nation then takes up, which we saw in Exodus 19. But it seems as we move on and as we read 2 Samuel 7 that the king takes over this role, so it seems a little bit odd. But a few things first. David's prayer after God makes the covenant with him reveals that God has included the kingship in his wider purposes of his mission. So David, the way we see this is David mentions God's previous dealings with Israel related to his wider purpose. So he mentions the Exodus, he mentions the Mosaic covenant and establishing Israel as a nation. He mentions the request to bless David's dynasty, reflecting the blessing given to Abraham for his family. So when we read David's prayer, what does that all tell us? It tells us that the king does not replace the people of Israel as God's instrument, but he represents the community that has experienced God's calling and deliverance. So David and his royal successors will represent Yahweh's rule over the covenant people and nations of the world. So it's this idea called corporate solidarity, where one person can represent a whole nation. We see this in modern politics, right? So when we talk about the President of the United States, he stands in for the nation, for the U.S., right? He's representing, he doesn't replace the United States, right? There's 330 million people in the U.S. He doesn't replace them, but he represents them, and he embodies the spirit or the views of the United States. And it's the same thing with the king. The king doesn't replace the nation, but he represents them. So he embodies what the nation is called to and their purpose in the world. We also see that the king or the line of David will provide the means to accomplish God's goals for all creation and the task given to Abraham's descendants. So thanks to this gracious gift or unfolding by God, from now on the agent, the main actor that leads the covenant people in fulfilling their calling to be life givers, to be blessing bringers, will be a descendant of Abraham and a descendant of David. So the one who, this connects back with, of course, Genesis 3, where the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. This person will now come through the line of David. So one of David's descendants will be the one who will bring an end to the rule of sin and who will bring the blessing to the nations of the earth. That's what's promised here. So this diagram, this very imperfect diagram at least, shows first the promise goes to Abraham, and then it's channeled to the nation. That the blessing to Abraham is given to the nation of Israel to be a blessing to the other nations. And then eventually it's now channeled through the king. So it started with one man, goes to a nation, and now it goes back to one man specifically. But 2 Samuel 9 through 24 show us David's failures repeatedly. And it shows that there's the need for one greater than David to come. Yes, David is the chosen king, but he's also sinful and does not perfectly follow the covenant. And so the epilogue gives hope in David's line, but David's failures point to the need for one greater than David to fulfill the covenant. So by the time we get to the end of 2 Samuel, we're waiting. We know that there's this covenant with Abraham, this covenant with the nation, and now this covenant with David, and we're waiting for a person to come fulfill that covenant. So that's where we end. We end with anticipation of a king from David's line who will bring blessing to the nations, who will undo the effects of the curse, because we see very clearly that person is not David. It is someone from his line.